185 Tips on World Building by Randy Ellefson. Read by Randy Ellefson. Copyright 2020 Randy Ellefson and Evermore Press. Introduction. Subscribers to the Art of World Building newsletter receive these tips in their inbox. These tips are collected here in this short volume and organized by the books from which they came. Creating Life Tips. Everything we need to know about how to create gods, species and races, plants, animals, monsters, heroes, villains, and even undead is included in Creating Life, The Art of World Building, Volume 1. Some basic techniques are also discussed, such as using analogues and deciding how many worlds to build in a career. As with every volume, this book includes reusable templates that can help you build better and faster. The tips in this section are from Creating Life, The Art of World Building, Volume 1. Analogues. These tips come from Chapter 1. Tip number 1. Use analogues. An analogue is a world-building element that has a corresponding version on Earth. Maybe we create a country modeled on Japan, using cultural and physical elements so that we don't have to invent everything from scratch. This shortcut helps us create realistic items for our world, but has a caveat of being less interesting and less original. Use wisely and you can save time and effort. Tip number 2. The Rule of 3. It's more of a guideline than a rule, but when using an analog, it's a good idea to make at least 3 major changes to it so our audience doesn't immediately recognize it. A large 4-legged pack animal with big tusks, floppy ears, and a trunk is obviously an elephant. What would you change to make it seem new? Tip number 3. Don't use names poorly. Avoid using a familiar name for something that's very different from something on Earth. If you call something an elf, people expect pointed ears. Failure to follow certain expectations will make them assume you don't know what you're doing. Use a new name if you've changed anything fundamental. Tip number 4. Mix and match analogues. We can combine elements from different analogues to help obscure where we got the idea. Take staple foods from one land, like rice and fish from Japan, culture from another, like Nazi Germany, and the typical appearance, including the clothing, of people from a third, such as an African tribe. Look at Earth like a buffet from which you can create a unique meal. Tip number 5. Make it worth it. Audiences have short memories, so we should keep an analog easy to describe and remember. This is aided by making the changes significant. Adding 2 extra legs to a horse may not be worth it, especially if all the horses are that way. It's not like the 6-legged kind are faster than the 4-legged ones that don't exist in your world. Make the alterations relevant or leave it like the original. How many worlds to build? The following tips come from Chapter 1 of Creating Life. Tip number 1. Determine your goals. If you're planning a long career, it may make sense to build one world extensively. Otherwise, you might build 20 worlds for 20 books. Is that more or less work than one in-depth setting? Figure out your intentions. Tip number 2. Use extreme worlds sparingly. Extreme worlds might be best suited to one-off stories due to the risks inherent in taking big chances with believability. Such places are ideal for science fiction when characters are planet hopping, but there's no reason characters in a fantasy setting can't be using magic or portals to do the same thing. Tip number 3. Be Earth-like most often. For any setting that's frequently used, it's wise to make it Earth-like in many basic respects, such as gravity, light, and oxygen, unless we intend to show the unusual features often. If we're less into world building, this is the default approach. We can change a few things, like adding species similar to dwarves, elves, and dragons, while keeping the rest familiar to our readers. Tip number 4. Reclaim wasted time. World building can be done in small bits. We don't need to devote months on end like we do with a novel, where we can lose our train of thought if we stop. It's a great way to reclaim lost time, like when standing in a line somewhere. Jot down ideas on your phone and flesh them out later. College often prevented me from writing, so I did world building in small bits, 10 or 30 minutes at a time, when I felt like I had a good idea. Tip number 5. Don't get overwhelmed. Remember that world building is optional. Yes, we might need to create a setting, but we can essentially make it Earth by another name if desired. Don't let world building become a chore or get overwhelmed by a big to-do list. Otherwise, you'll just give up. World building is supposed to be fun. Summary of Creating Life Chapter 1, Why build a world? While world building is expected in many genres of fantasy and science fiction, we must decide how many worlds to build. This will depend on our career plans and goals. Learn the advantages and disadvantages of building one world for each story versus one world for many stories, and when to take each approach. Sometimes doing both is best, allowing for greater depth in one world, but the option to step away to keep things fresh. Using analogues can help us create believable societies quickly, but has pitfalls that can be avoided. Do you have the ability to create many interesting worlds, and will they have enough depth to make the effort worth it? The Gods. These tips come from Chapter 2 of Creating Life. Tip number 1. Decide whether to create them. A story that doesn't need gods frees us from inventing them. That might change if the setting is a world we'll use often, as a religious character would crop up sooner or later. But single-use worlds can get away without deities, though it's arguably better to just create a lone god and skimp on details or a pantheon. If you don't have a feel for what to do, skip this, or read Creating Life to gain ideas. Tip number 2. Science doesn't eliminate religion. A popular theory states that with more science we have less religion, but look at our own world to see how much religion exists despite all of our scientific accomplishments. Science may explain things that were once held to be of divine origin, but beliefs persist. Your world's inhabitants will still believe in a higher being most likely, even if you decide not to comment on it. Tip number 3. Are the gods real? In fantasy, deities are typically real or sometimes put in an appearance. Science fiction often doesn't mention the gods, but if so, they seldom show up. Decide if the world's gods are real and whether they interfere in events. What are some famous incidents and consequences? Read Creating Life for ideas. Tip number 4. We can reuse deities. If we create a detailed setting we repeatedly use, gods are one of the subjects we need to invent only once because they exist outside the scope of our current story and can be reused. This is one reason to create a single well-developed world. One detailed pantheon can be more entertaining and be a common theme across stories. Why create pantheons over and over? Tip number 5. Use analogues. We can borrow gods of various Earth pantheons and alter them to fit our setting. This helps us get started. At the least, we can create a list of gods and their attributes, and then start mixing and matching what we like to create our own versions, like Dr. Frankenstein creating gods. Tip number 6. Create a pantheon. A group of gods is more work to invent, but offers opportunities for conflicts among the deities. These can reflect cultural and moral issues, such as myths about gods facing struggles similar to those of their worshippers. Pantheons offer a good way to characterize our residents, as everyone might worship someone else. Tip number 7. Make the gods vulnerable. Beings that can't be hurt or killed are less interesting. If you decide one is dead or wounded, determine how, who did it, and the impacts this had on gods and mortals alike. Do they die from natural causes? Tip number 8. Children. Make your gods capable of reproducing, whether that creates more gods, demigods, or just superhumans or other species. This can give a world heroes like Hercules. It can even make a mortal woman want to seduce a god. Now there's a story idea. Tip number 9. How does time end? Decide how life as everyone knows it will end, even if you never use this in a story beyond someone mentioning your world's Armageddon. It's fun deciding how everyone will be destroyed. Find a good reason for it happening, whether it's moral decay or something more physical. Tip number 10. Create myths. Myths make a world more entertaining, but only invent them if there's a chance they'll be used. Self-publishers can use a myth as bonus materials in a newsletter, website, or short story. Summary of Creating Life Chapter 2. Gods. Our species will invent gods to believe in, even if we don't invent them. So we may need some deities for people to reference in dialogue, whether praying or swearing. In science fiction, belief in gods may still exist despite or even because of advances in science. In fantasy, priests often call on a god to heal someone, and this requires having invented the gods. Pantheons offer advantages over a lone god, including dynamic relationships between them and the species. Half-gods and demigods are other options that help us create myths and legends to enrich our world, especially if gods can be born, die, or be visited in their realm. Myths about how the gods or species came to exist help people understand the purpose of their lives and what awaits them in death. Symbols, appearance, patronage, and willingness to impact the lives of their species all color a pantheon and world. Gods also create places people can visit or items that can fall into the wrong hands, offering possibilities for stories. Species. These tips come from Chapter 3 of Creating Life. Tip number 1. Decide whether to create them. Some science fiction and even fantasy, like Game of Thrones, has nothing but humans, so you may not need to invent a species at all. Or you might be writing a genre with public domain races you can use, like elves. We can do a mix of these, using the latter while inventing a few of our own, but this has risks too. Read Creating Life to understand why and how to manage them. The best reason to invent is arguably that you have a great idea. Tip number 2. Decide if they're species or races. We have leeway to call our humanoid species or race, but it might be best to use both terms and create a hierarchy that makes it easier to understand relationships. Decide which ones inherited DNA from others, or which ones developed on their own, or were independently created by the gods. This is fundamental to creating relationships. Volume 1 explains how to structure humanoids for the best of both worlds. Tip number 3. Determine how you'll use them. A race that's just a monster in the woods is easier to create than one that must have a full culture and stand alongside classic races as a well-developed humanoid. Consider how your invention can be used to discover benefits and limitations that you can either accept or overcome. Maybe the monster in the woods version isn't allowed in cities, so you create a tamer race that is accepted. This can cause complexity, realism, and a fun plot point as characters aren't sure which one they're dealing with until it's too late. Tip number 4. How integrated are they? A species that keeps to itself in mountains or forests will have different attitudes about others than one that gets around. Is it realistic that they're so isolated? Invent a good reason if so, such as troubling history with others. Consider having them frequently live among humans and others, as this can create even more conflict than hiding away. A tension is where stories lie. Tip number 5. Determine how environment affected them. Like dwarves, anything living underground is bound to be short. A forest-dwelling species might not run well, while one on the plains likely does. Physical adaptations are probable unless that race lives in a wide range of environments, like us. Once this is decided, we can determine how that environment affected their culture too. Giving thought to this makes our species more cohesive. Tip number 6. Don't give a species a uniform disposition. Much of the tension in life, at least among us humans, is not knowing whether someone is good or evil, to be simplistic about it. Making invented species be uniformly one way or another makes them predictable, which is less interesting. But if we invent multiple races of them, this variety makes them more entertaining. Tip number 7. Use avatar creators to invent a head. A free online avatar creator can help you invent faces that are typical of your invented species. This can help visualize something and be provided to an artist if we want someone to draw our creation. It also helps us avoid being unintentionally ridiculous. Tip number 8. Create races for variety. If all the elves, for example, look the same, that means a wood elf and a drow can masquerade as each other. This gives us opportunities for mayhem that don't exist if every race of a species looks different. Besides, why not surprise our other characters and readers alike? Tip number 9. Decide how they get along with everyone, not just humans. It's easy to overlook how two invented species get along with each other because we're trying to figure out how each gets along with humans. More thought given to this makes our world more believable and engaging. Envision each race's viewpoint on how people should behave, and then what they think of another race's behavior. Tip number 10. Determine their view on magic and technology. We should decide how educated a species is, as this may impact their ability to do magic or invent or use technology. If they can't read and spells are hard to learn orally, they may be unable to cast them, unless they can do it without a spell like a god. However, even uneducated species can steal a spaceship, for example, and those need janitors too, so be clever in finding ways that the less fortunate can have power that maybe they shouldn't. Summary of Creating Life, Chapter 3, Species. Audiences are familiar with using the word race to distinguish between humanoids, especially in fantasy, but the word species may be a more appropriate term. This chapter explores the meaning and implications of both words, with some examples of which one to use, when, and why. Creating a species is challenging and time-consuming, but the risks and rewards can be navigated and achieved, respectively. This chapter helps us decide on our goals and if the effort is worth it. Science fiction writers might have little choice but to create species because there are no public domain species available like the elves, dwarves, and dragons of fantasy. The benefits of creating something different can outweigh the investment and help our world stand out. An invented species must compete with legendary ones like the elves, dwarves, and dragons. This chapter helps us achieve this. Starting with habitat helps us decide on physical adaptations that affect their minds, outlook, and society, and what a typical settlement might be like, and even whether they live in jointly formed settlements. Their disposition affects their relationships with other species, but can also limit their usefulness to us unless steps are taken to avoid this. Characteristics like intelligence, wisdom, and dexterity all play a role in how they can be used in our work, as does their society and worldview, both affected by a history we can invent to integrate them with our world. Their familiarity with the supernatural and technology influences their prominence and how they compare to the other life in our world. World figures. These tips come from Chapter 4 of Creating Life. Tip number 1. Decide who the heroes and villains are. There are many types of world figures, some hated, others revered. In your world, what kind of people make good figures to reference? Warriors, explorers, inventors, and leaders come to mind. Determine what they did and what they're famous for by deciding how you're going to use them, as characters or someone to mention. Tip number 2. Determine their status. Living figures provide ongoing opportunities for new fame, but dead heroes tend to be more revered. If they're alive, decide what they're doing now. Are they retired, in hiding, imprisoned? Tip number 3. What items did they have? Whether the figure is alive or dead, they might have had cool items, including ships or steeds, that are lost or in the wrong hands. This is a great way to make these figures still relevant if current characters have their weapons and armor. Invent some items and reasons they're famous. What can they do that others can't? Tip number 4. Who are their relatives? So often the relatives of world figures aren't mentioned at all, as if everyone was born in a test tube and raised by no one. Determine who their relatives are, including descendants, and how they feel about this figure. Don't forget that every species probably has a different opinion on this guy too. He might be a villain to one and a hero to another. Tip number 5. Where did they learn? Most famous people have special skills. Where did this guy get his? This can be important if he was a villain who killed his master for knowledge, for example. A hero might have inherited knowledge from a mentor grooming him for great things. These aspects characterize our figure and make them human. Summary of Creating Life, Chapter 4, World Figures. Villains, heroes, and more give our characters admired or despised individuals who've shaped their world and inspired them. Using Earth analogues can speed the invention of such world figures, though it's best to change some details to hide the similarities. Living figures can provide ongoing usefulness, but the deceased can cast a long shadow too. Their possessions can be just as famous and offer opportunities for our characters to find something helpful or dangerous. Family, friends, and enemies also provide ongoing possibilities for their life to impact our current characters. Monsters. These tips come from Chapter 5 of Creating Life. Tip number 1. Do you need monsters? Our story might not need monsters, but in games, what else is there to kill but species and animals? Adventuring characters need threats to worry about, but a species or animal can suffice. The best reason to invent a monster is the reason they've historically been created, to instruct us in morality and other concerns about how to live. Find your theme and invent your monster. Tip number 2. Determine what it can do. A monster's skills are often the reason it's terrifying. Decide on one or two traits that it uses to kill, hide, or terrify people, even if this is on accident. This should coincide with your purpose. Get started by fantasizing scenes of people hunting it, being hunted, or fighting it, and what signs of its existence it leaves behind. Tip number 3. Understand the differences between monsters, species, and animals. Members of a species are a lot smarter than a monster, usually. A villain like Dracula being an exception, partly because he was once human and not dead for long. Animals differ in being numerous, whereas a monster is typically the only one of its kind, but we can break these rules once we think about them. Tip number 4. Decide where your monster originated. Accidents are an easy way to create monsters, especially in science fiction, where imaginary technology can wreak havoc. But magic and other supernatural forces can do the same. Consider whether someone created your monster on purpose, too, and for what reason. This can give us a world figure. Evolution might also have led to this creature's existence. Determine its origins to create a well-formed monster. Tip number 5. Decide what the monster wants. Whether it's food, revenge, security, peace and quiet, or to hoard treasure, knowing what the monster wants will determine its behavior and lair. Treasure is a silly thing for a monster to desire, given that money is only useful when we're part of a society, and a monster isn't, by definition. Summary of Creating Life Chapter 5. Monsters. The difference between monsters, species, and animals is largely sophistication and numbers. Many monsters are created by accidents that transform an existing species or animal, but sometimes monsters are created on purpose. In the latter case, it's especially important to decide who caused this and why. A monster's habitat has an impact on its usefulness and sets the stage for creating atmosphere and characterization that will largely define our audience's experience with it before the terrifying reveal. Its motivations in life, or in our work, also determine what it does and the sort of trouble it's causing for our species. Plants and animals. These tips come from Chapter 6 of Creating Life. Tip number 1. Decide whether to invent plants or animals. Learn the benefit of creating either and how to speed up the process using analogues or the templates from Creating Life. In science fiction, we really need to invent them if characters are on other worlds where the plants and animals will be different. Fantasy can get away with mostly Earth-like life, with some additions if we have ideas. Creating Life can help you think of some. Tip number 2. How will you and characters use it? There's no reason to invent something if we don't have a plan for it. Both plants and animals are good for products to make life better. Create a list of these uses, such as decoration, food, medicine, entertainment, guards, pets, transportation, and food. This will create goals for you to achieve with invention. Tip number 3. Research Earth analogues. Creating plants and animals from scratch isn't easy, so learn to model them on analogues from Earth. Researching even familiar ones can turn up surprising facts we didn't know. These can be used as inspiration while freeing us to tweak details to our liking. That way, we don't have to get it right, because we're the authority. Tip number 4. Understand classifications. Animals are classified as amphibians, birds, fish, mammals, and reptiles, while plants are classified as seedless, seeding, and flowering. Understanding the differences can help us be specific and invent details that make our new life forms worth the time it took to create them. Tip number 5. Know your limits. It's usually best to imagine only a few plants and animals for a setting, simply because we won't have much occasion to mention them. This is true of even worlds we'll use for decades in a long-cherished career. In such cases, new life can often be invented on the fly, so this is an area of world-building that is ripe for doing piecemeal rather than all at once. Summary of Creating Life Chapter 6. Plants and Animals. In fantasy, creating plants and animals is optional due to expectations that the world is very Earth-like, but in science fiction that takes place off-Earth, audiences are more likely to expect new ones. It takes less time to create these than other life, but we'll want to consider our time investment, how often our setting will be used, whether our creations impact our work and the impression it creates, and whether the desire to do something unique and new is worthwhile for both us and our audience. Plants and animals are classified into categories, such as cycads, conifers, and flowering plants, and amphibians, birds, fish, mammals, and reptiles. The life cycle of plants and the behavior of animals helps distinguish them, and can be used to propel or inhibit stories involving them. While we may have purposes for them as an author, our world's inhabitants have them too, such as using them for decorations and medicine for plants, and domestication, sports, guards, pets, and transportation for animals. Both can be used for food and materials to enrich life and our world. Undead. These tips come from Chapter 7 of Creating Life. Tip number 1. Decide if you need to invent undead. Creating new undead is challenging because so many useful types are public domain, meaning we can use them without violating copyright laws. Inventing something similar to an Earth analog is ripe for ridicule as just a vampire with some minor difference added. Make sure you really need your undead's skills, appearance, traits, or behaviors before creating them. Tip number 2. Determine what the undead wants. Everyone needs a goal in life, or in this case, undead life. But some undead are in denial about their status, so decide if it knows it's dead and how it feels about that if so, or why it's unaware. This can determine whether it wants peace, revenge, or has unfinished business that keeps it here. Tip number 3. What type of undead is it? Determine whether an undead is non-corporeal or if it has a body, and what state of decay that body is in. This will help determine the impact it has on those who see it or encounter it. Don't be afraid to create undead plants and animals. If it's alive, it can be dead, and if it can die, it can return. Tip number 4. Decide its origins. Did someone create your undead on purpose or by accident? We can use phenomena, technology, or magic to do this. Also decide if the undead can create more of itself, such as vampires do. This will determine their numbers, which in turn decides how much experience people have with it. That will decide if they know how to kill it. Tip number 5. Can it be killed? Whether or not the undead can be permanently destroyed is what the living will most want to know about it, so decide. Then figure out how and when this can be done. Feel free to be inventive, as everyone loves a good death. Summary of Creating Life Chapter 7. Undead. Many types of undead already exist and are public domain, and it's challenging to invent something new. Undead are often classified by appearance and behavior, but it is also their origins and how they can be destroyed that will help distinguish our undead from pre-existing types. The two basic ones are those with a body, like zombies, and those without, like ghosts. Those with a body might have a soul or not. We can decide on the mental faculties of our undead by deciding if the mind goes with the soul, but there are other factors that can impair the mind and even emotional states of undead. All these affect behavior, as do their origins, goals, and what they're capable of. End of Creating Life Tips. Creating Places Tips. The life we create needs to originate from somewhere on a planet, an ocean, a continent, in a land feature like a forest or mountain range, in a kingdom, or in a settlement. Creating Places, The Art of Worldbuilding Volume 2, goes into details about inventing such locations and figuring out how long it takes to travel between them by various forms of locomotion: foot, horse, wagon, dragon, wooden ship, spaceship, and more. The overall rules of our world are also considered, along with inventing time, history, various places of interest, and how to draw maps. We can start our work with any one of those subjects and crisscross between places and life, for one often impacts the other. The tips in this section are from Creating Places, The Art of Worldbuilding Volume 2. Planets. These tips come from Chapter 2. Tip number 1. Understand what our moon causes. If we want a world with no moon or more than one, we should understand how this affects tides, seasons, hours in the day, and moonlight. Tidal locking is also what keeps the same side of our moon facing us, but does your moon rotate, and how quickly? And what does this imply about your worlds? More than one moon means more interesting conjunctions of planetary bodies and eclipses too. Creating Places includes a spreadsheet to help determine orbits. Tip number 2. Determine the solar system's other planets. There's a tendency in fantasy to not mention other planets, even though they could be seen from Earth during ancient times, not just with modern technology. In science fiction, world builders often do decide these matters. We'll need to understand the different planet types and where they are likely to form or be now, because it can change. Mentioning them and having characters imagine that they are realms to which one can be banished, for example, adds realism. Tip number 3. Be careful with constellations. Did you know that people in the northern hemisphere see one set of constellations, and those in the south see different ones? This can matter if we decide that the world's gods have constellations. Each deity might need 2 of them, one for each hemisphere. Otherwise, half the world may never know they've got one, not to mention see it. Tip number 4. Don't forget dark constellations. There are dark constellations that most of us in the northern hemisphere might be unaware of, because most are only visible in the southern hemisphere. These are clouds of interstellar gas that block the light of stars behind them from reaching us. These could be used to represent our so-called evil deities. Tip number 5. Use tidal locking. The phrase tidal locking makes us think of tides, but it's unrelated. This means that an orbiting satellite doesn't rotate, like our moon, which is tidally locked to the Earth. This is why we always see the same side of it. This is the eventual result of all orbiting bodies, due to gravitational effects. We can use this for habitable moons, or even a planet, which, if tidally locked to its sun, will roast on one side and freeze on the other. While this might make Earth-like life impossible, it's an interesting place to visit if we're properly protected. Tip number 6. Understand the ocean's impact. Ocean currents move in certain patterns that mean one side of a continent has warmer water than the other. This is usually the same across a world. Why does it matter? It affects what sea life might be there and what the climate is like. We don't need to leverage this, but the knowledge helps make one location on our world feel different from another, rather than all getting no comment on the climate or its impact on vegetation, livestock, and culture. Tip number 7. Use prevailing winds to shape the land. If your planet spins, it has prevailing winds, which are either east or west. Which direction depends on which way the planet rotates, but it also depends on how far from the equator we're talking. It changes direction depending on latitude, and it's important to know where this happens on your continent because it affects vegetation. Tip number 8. Understand rain shadows. If there's a north to south mountain range, moisture-carrying prevailing winds must go over them. This causes the rain to fall on the windward side of those mountains, but then there's no water left for the leeward side. The result is a desert. Tip number 9. Know your desert types. Hot deserts have clear, sunny skies, hence the heat, but they get cold at night due to those same skies. Cold deserts are also hot during the day, but brutally cold, far below freezing, in winter. Mild deserts are, well, milder than both. Each is found in certain climates or locations, inland, coastal, or at high elevations. Knowing which is found where is not only more accurate, but also lets us create easily distinguishable regions. Tip number 10. Use analogues for climate. It can be easier to base a whole continent's climates based on a familiar region. If you know the climate in Europe, assume your continent is similar and is surrounded by similar land masses. The shapes you draw on a map can be different, but this is a quick way to get it right without the research. Summary of Creating Places, Chapter 2, Planets. This chapter focuses on creating an Earth-like planet. World builders should understand the role of the moon and its effect on tides, seasons, and more if we intend to have a moon different from our own or multiple moons. Mention of other planets, constellations, and comets can make our world seem less like it's an island. The equator, climate zones, prevailing winds, and rain shadows all affect how much precipitation falls in an area, which in turn affects all life there, including vegetation or the lack thereof. Understanding these basics will help us create believable landscapes. Continents. These tips come from Chapter 3 of Creating Places. Tip number 1. Decide how many continents to create. Even if our story only takes place on one land mass, we should at least roughly create other continents and give them names. Knowing their direction from our main one and how hard they are to reach tells us and readers how likely visitors from far-off lands are. Each continent might be known for a few things, such as slavery, rare gems or other items, strange regions, or interesting creatures. Some of these things might find their way to our main continent, which is why we ought to have some idea on this. It makes our continent seem less isolated. Tip number 2. Decide on the hemisphere. If we've lived our whole life in one hemisphere, we might need to remind ourselves that the seasons are reversed in the other one. The visible constellations are too, and the moon appears upside down. Most importantly, an expression like going south for the winter makes no sense in the southern hemisphere. Tip number 3. Understand plate tectonics and mountain ranges. We don't need to be experts in plate tectonics. Just know that explosive volcanic mountain ranges along coastlines are common due to two plates converging there. If this happens at sea, we can find a chain of islands. But when it happens between two continental plates, we get the tallest mountains, which are not volcanic. But technically a volcano can happen anywhere if there's a flaw in the plate below. Tip number 4. Waterways. Did you know a sea and ocean are the same thing? Sea is just used to denote a smaller area of an ocean. Bays, gulfs, coves, and fjords are all bays but of different sizes and configurations. They can be connected by a strait, channel, pass, or passage, which are all also the same thing. Tip number 5. What's an island? Some islands are so big that we might be tempted to call them a continent, such as Australia. The distinction is largely one of size. Use your judgment. However, actual islands are either oceanic or continental. The former are far out to sea and volcanic. Summary of Creating Places Chapter 3. Continents. Which hemisphere our continent lies in affects the seasons and might impact where we place constellations. Understanding plate tectonics can help us build believable mountain ranges and place volcanoes where they might occur. This can also determine where deep areas of the sea are, giving our sea monsters somewhere to call home. We have some liberty in which term we use for a body of water, but this chapter includes details on when to use which name, including seas, bays, inlets, and more. Land features. These tips come from Chapter 4 of Creating Places. Tip number 1. Know where volcanic mountains aren't. When an oceanic and a continental tectonic plate meet, the former descends under the latter and causes volcanoes, but when two continental plates meet, they fold on top of each other, creating the highest mountains on Earth. They also aren't volcanic. Your interior mountains will be the tallest. Tip number 2. Olympus Mons on Mars is huge and boring. With Mount Everest being 29,000 feet, Olympus Mons on Mars might seem far more impressive at almost 70,000 feet, but it's not. It's so wide, the size of France, that you wouldn't even realize you're standing on one. It won't cut a majestic figure against the sky. Bigger isn't always better. Tip number 3. A volcano can be anywhere. Due to random faults that appear in tectonic plates, we can put a volcano anywhere we want. Tip number 4. Mountains humanize dragons. Dragons often appear invincible, but if we want to be more realistic, make it harder for them to fly at high altitudes. This happens with real Earth birds, who struggle to get over very tall mountains. Making your dragons struggle too gives them a vulnerability and makes them seem more plausible. Tip number 5. Decide how old a river is. Not all rivers are the same. Younger rivers tend towards being fast, rapid, and somewhat straight. By contrast, ancient rivers are slow, wide, and meander in a zigzag pattern. Tip number 6. Know your forest types. Why have every forest be a generic one when we can distinguish between forests, savannas, woodlands, and jungles? Each gives a different impression and causes variation in animals and creatures present, plus travel conditions. Tip number 7. Know where grasslands are. They tend to be located farther from a mountain range that is causing a rain shadow. It's reasonable to have a forest on one side of the mountains and a desert on the other. Tip number 8. Don't forget wetlands. Mires, bogs, swamps, and marshes may appear similar to us if we haven't done our research, but Creating Places gives you enough detail to tell you and show your audience the difference. They can form boundaries that average people don't want to enter, or places from which strange creatures emerge. They also let us create a more varied landscape. Tip number 9. Deserts tend to be rocky. We associate huge sand dunes with deserts, but the majority are covered in hard, packed earth, almost like pavement. This is hard on the feet or hooves, but offers a very different experience than sand as far as trudging along is concerned. Understand where this happens to utilize it effectively. Tip number 10. Decide on the cultivation level. Some worlds have been terraformed while others are wild, untamed expanses. Decide how much your species have cultivated the world. This can include burning down forests, dumping toxic wastes, turning deserts into cities, and much more. Summary of Creating Places Chapter 4. Land Features. A continent will have mountains, volcanoes, lakes, rivers, forests, woodlands, savannas, jungles, prairies, wetlands, and deserts. But world builders should understand each to place them in believable locations. While some aspects are obvious, minor details can change our decisions and augment our resulting stories. Why say characters have entered a run-of-the-mill forest when we can say it's a savanna instead, describing how it looks and what life is like for inhabitants and those traversing it. This chapter aids world builders in making a more varied landscape, one that is accurately depicted. Sovereign Powers. These tips come from Chapter 5 of Creating Places. Tip number 1. Is the sovereign recognized? Just because your sovereign power declares itself to be one, that doesn't mean other countries acknowledge this sovereignty. Even within a power, some might not recognize it. This sort of dispute gives rise to stories like Game of Thrones. When Napoleon dubbed himself Emperor of France, the rest of Europe disagreed. We can leverage such scenarios. Tip number 2. You're head of what? There's a difference between the head of state and head of government, though the same person can be in both roles. Certain government types separate them while others don't. Conflict can be easily achieved by pitting two people against each other, but you'll need to know when this makes sense. Tip number 3. Invent for today. You should have a present state in mind for your sovereign power because the form of government may have changed repeatedly in the past, and again in the future. This happens for quite a few reasons, including war, a weak ruler, or economics. A past colors the present both in monuments, buildings, and other architectural items, but also in population attitude, which is something to add to character backstories. Tip number 4. Decide who lives there. We should have an idea what percentage of the overall population each of our species and races is. This helps determine how common other languages are, and if the culture of the other species is an influence. A reason for the inclusion or exclusion can add tension, such as racism or one species preferring a landscape feature, like a forest, and being there despite attempts at eradicating them. Tip number 5. What's the world view? There are many ideas we can give our sovereign power, including the freedom, or lack thereof, to perform magic, own property, use water-based vessels and spacecraft, and technology generally, or how welcoming they are of other species and cultures. Creating Places has a list of things to consider. Tip number 6. Government types. Authoritative states. Whether an autocracy, totalitarian, dictatorship, or authoritarian government, authoritative states are not the most pleasant ones to live in unless you're the ones in power. With severe restrictions on freedoms, our hero can find himself or herself under duress to accomplish what they desire. They make great places for your hero to destroy or at least kill the state's leader. The differences discussed in Creating Places can help make our sovereign powers stand out from each other. Tip number 7. Government types. Democracies. A democracy allows people to participate in government by having influence over which policies are made into laws. This means far more freedom for the population, and therefore our heroes, who might originate from such a place and be philosophically opposed to more oppressive regimes. Wanting to free someone they love or respect from such a place is the sort of thing that makes them heroic. Tip number 8. Government types. Federations. Whether an empire, confederation, or unitary state, federations contain states that have some sovereignty over their own affairs while still following the laws of the federation. Some are members voluntarily, while others are not, and some can leave them when they want, but others cannot. Their point of origin is also different. Tip number 9. Government types. Monarchies. Kingdoms are common in fantasy but less so in science fiction, but either way, they're not all the same. The two main types are absolute versus constitutional. The former has a ruler who has no limits on his power, a scenario ripe for abuse, especially with the divine right of kings being employed. A constitutional monarchy gives more power to the people via parliament and results in a ruler with often severe restrictions on their powers. Tip number 10. Government types. Oligarchies and more. An oligarchy is any form of government where power is controlled by a small group of people. This could be those in the military, those with magic power, the wealthy, merchants, or other groups we invent. Some of these variations have names like theocracy, aristocracy, or military junta, and each may have stark differences that let us create more variation on our world. Summary of Creating Places, Chapter 5. Sovereign Powers. Kingdoms, empires, dictatorships, and more are types of sovereign powers that world builders can create. Before we do, a high-level understanding of the differences between them is crucial. Many variations to government types exist, which gives us freedom to tweak details for our needs, but we should know the rules before we break them. The role of sovereignty, including how it is gained and lost, is examined in this chapter along with the divine right of kings. We also look at the head of state and head of government roles, the differences between them, and the conflicts that can arise. The nature of each branch of government is examined along with parliamentary systems. Democracies, federations, theocracies, monarchies, autocracies, and more are examined for their key differences. Inventing a sovereign power should include friends and enemies who shape policy, lifestyle, and culture. The form of government has significant impact on inhabitants and results from worldview. History affects this as well, and while creating a history is optional, it enriches the dynamics of relationships and can create heroes, villains, and attitudes in the population. We should consider which species are present and in what percentage, and what languages are spoken or forbidden. Our power's location and climate will impact lifestyles and vegetation, which also influences what natural resources it has or lacks, and what the power does as a result. These can all lead to tensions both with outside powers or the residents within. Symbols, colors, flags, and slogans will be a source of pride and even fear for both foreigners and the population. Settlements. These tips come from Chapter 6 of Creating Places. Tip number 1. Do quarters exist? In New Orleans we have the French Quarter. We can do the same with our species, resulting in an Elven or Dwarven Quarter. We should decide if these exist based on population density. There should be sufficient numbers of a race to do this, but not so many that they overflow and live where they please. Decide how accommodating they are of other species entering or staying in their quarter, and how much that quarter caters to their needs. Tip number 2. Who lives here? It's easy to make a settlement mostly human by default, but strive to include other species in prominent and even dominant ways. Are joint settlements likely at some point, at least somewhere on your world, like the melting pot of America and other parts of the world? Decide where this takes place and what sorts of tensions and prejudices creep into daily life. This makes our species seem less like islands. Tip number 3. Where is Old Town? In large settlements there's probably an Old Town, which might be called something else, from when the place was first settled. Decide where this is and whether it's a run-down warren of thieves and back alleys or a highly preserved source of pride. Either way, it's likely near the original water source and has smaller streets and shops. Tip number 4. What's the terrain like? Both in and around a settlement, terrain can affect placement and layout of structures from walls to buildings. Few places are uniformly flat, so where is the higher ground? Did the wealthy stake it for themselves? There might be giant boulders and other obstacles that must be built around. Maybe a wetland encroaches on the town so that some of it is built on stilts, like Venice. Tip number 5. What's the climate? Climate affects the way people dress and behave. If it's hot and humid, maybe people only work during the morning and night. If it's frigid, maybe they work during the afternoon heat. Customs and expectations also arise from such things. If you've worked out the continent's location, figuring out climate is relatively easy and is almost done for you. Summary of Creating Places, Chapter 6. Settlements. Location impacts a settlement more than many world builders realize, from climate to terrain and water supply, but our neighbors also determine how much fortification is needed and the number of armed forces, including their skill sets. Ancient and recent history can bring lasting change and cause attitudes that enrich our setting. Our population's diversity is also critical for determining what life is like for the majority and minorities alike. But first we need to decide who is who and why, how much power they have, and whether they can subvert those who are supposedly in power. Whether outposts, castles, villages, towns, or cities, or even an orbiting station, a settlement will have secrets, a reputation, colors, symbols, and local lore that characterize it in the minds of inhabitants, friends, and enemies. Land travel. These tips come from Chapter 7 of Creating Places. Tip number 1. Make dragons believable. While anything huge that flies is not very believable to begin with, we can make them more so by giving limitations. Even normal birds struggle at high altitudes and might be unable to get over very tall mountains, above 20,000 feet. Dragons and other large animals would never make it unless we decide their magic helps them. We like them all powerful, but maybe forcing them to fly around is better. Tip number 2. Terrain slows. A forest can slow travelers due to underbrush and being unable to see threats from a distance, requiring caution. Desert sand will stop a wagon and slow walkers, but most deserts are hard earth and just tough on wheels and feet and hooves. Wetlands are worse. Hills and mountains cause fatigue and reduce speed and endurance. However, a road mitigates some of these issues. Be sure to take the terrain into account when determining how long your character's trips will take. Tip number 3. Don't draw to scale. While it's good to try for accuracy when determining distances and travel times on maps, writing not drawn to scale on them gives us leeway to be wrong about something. After all, we're storytellers, not masters at cartography or modes of travel we don't use anymore, like horses, wagons, or hovercraft. I stopped using the latter years ago. Tip number 4. Know how fast things travel. If you're writing fantasy, you need to know how far a horse, wagon, or humans, or another species, moves in a day under normal conditions. Ideally, avoid commenting on it, but this is hard given that characters move through dangerous places and must camp for the night, and we typically mention the dangers while covering said journey. Creating places makes it easier to know this by providing that data. Tip number 5. Get the travel template. You can save a ton of time by using the travel template sent to newsletter subscribers. It features a way to set the scale on your map, the base distance per day that various animals travel, how to size areas, terrain modifiers, and how long it takes to travel between locations. And if you change your scale, the numbers adjust for you. Summary of Creating Places Chapter 7. Travel over land. In settings without automobiles, world builders may struggle to determine how long it really takes people to traverse a distance, whether between settlements or land features. Mountains, hills, desert, and vegetation all impact speed and endurance, whether one is walking, riding a steed, or even flying one, or hauling freight. The presence and quality of roads alter this, as do life forms that might cause weariness and therefore slower travel. A methodology is presented to assist with organizing distance measurements and scale, determining the base miles per day for various modes of travel, and terrain modders to this. Using both miles and kilometers, formulas are provided for making calculations, which can also be estimated for overall land area in sovereign powers. Newsletter subscribers receive an Excel spreadsheet that can be used to alter scale and modifiers so that all calculations are automatically updated, reducing the need for manual calculations. Water travel. These tips come from Chapter 8 of Creating Places. Tip number 1. Confusion is normal. There are many reasons why it's difficult to determine the speed of non-motorized sailing vessels. This includes oarsmen being unable to row continuously, shifting wind speed or direction through a journey, damage to ships, and different degrees of encumbrance, or how weighed down the ship is. All of these change estimates. Maybe it comes as no surprise that we aren't sure how long a trip will take, but Creating Places gives you enough info to figure it out. Tip number 2. Know your ship rates. Wooden ships are rated based on how many guns and men they have, though the number of decks and masts can imply this as well. In a world without guns, we can still rate them based on armament. Ships of smaller rates were unlikely to attack bigger ships, so take this into account when determining which vessels your story needs. Tip number 3. No guns? Now what? In a world without gunpowder, there are no cannons, making our ships tame, unless we find an alternative. Catapults, trebuchets, and ballista all have their pros and cons. The latter could be the best and most effective replacement without causing other believability issues in your work, but you'll need to understand the number of crew needed to operate one versus a cannon. Tip number 4. Know your ship types. Whether it's a galley, brig, frigate, galleon, sloop of war, or ship of the line, our ship has an appearance, size, capability, and reputation we can utilize with skill if we know it. We don't need to invent something new because readers seldom see these and aren't bored with them. We can make changes at will, providing they make sense, because many variations exist on Earth anyway. Feel free to tweak the design of a known vessel. once you know where to start. Tip number 5. Determine base speeds first. Most wooden ships average between 2 and 6 knots over a long trip. They can be becalmed, which means 0 knots, or reach top speeds of 11 knots, but none sustain that without magic. We can fudge the time needed, but we should know what's possible. This includes being able to convert miles to nautical miles. Just multiply it by 1.151. Then divide the nautical miles by the average knots to learn how many hours the trip would take. Summary of Creating Places Chapter 8. Travel by Water. Landlubbers have difficulty determining how long it takes for any ship, whether powered by oars or sails, to traverse a distance. This chapter explores the factors affecting sailing speeds and what vessels are most likely to be used during an age of sail period. Calculations are provided for realistic estimates. Both long and round ships are discussed, including the galley, brig, frigate, galleon, sloop of war, and ship of the line. In fantasy, we have species and warrior types who might be part of our crew. We might also rule out gunpowder and cannon, which means having ships with no real firepower or which use alternative weapons. Subscribers to the Art of Worldbuilding newsletter receive an Excel spreadsheet that performs calculations in kilometers, miles, and nautical miles. Space travel. These tips come from Chapter 9 of Creating Places. Tip number 1. Distance changes. Remember that everything in space is orbiting something else, and at different speeds, and therefore the distance between two objects is ever changing. Two planets could be on the same side of the Sun at one point in the year, but on opposite sides at another. This gives us leeway to decide how long a trip between them would take at any given moment in our story. Tip number 2. Know your engine types. Our ship might need air-breathing engines if it's going to enter an atmosphere, and those are typically rear-facing even if located on the side or elsewhere. Space engines are either jump, hyper, or warp drives, all being public domain options we can use. Each has expected properties and effects, such as time dilation. Including all three in your story world gives you the most options. Tip number 3. Be consistent. With invented technologies, try to be consistent with the level of tech people have. A Star Trek teleprompter and food replicator are equally unbelievable. Would it make sense to have a teleporter but no artificial gravity? Probably not, because the latter is easier to achieve with a ship that rotates. It would be a mistake to do something like have a flamethrower but not have open flame stoves. Tip number 4. Decide on internal structure. Unless your ship has only one room, you should map out where important rooms are, like the bridge, propulsion, and crew quarters. This lets you plan how long it takes for people to move about the ship. The larger the vessel, the more useful this planning becomes. Damage or an intrusion in one area might mean a lot of time could pass before your heroes arrive to deal with it. You could do this to avoid everything being too convenient for them. Tip number 5. Does your external structure matter? Aerodynamics don't matter in space. We've seen and accepted Borg cubes in Star Trek. Just decide that your ship isn't planning to enter an atmosphere before going this route. But be aware that there is still a stellar wind, but most readers won't be thinking about this sort of thing. Summary of Creating Places Chapter 9. Travel in Space. Science fiction features invented technologies for traveling the cosmos, but that doesn't free us from attempts to be realistic about life in space or how to maneuver. Modern engines operate on the principle of thrust, which requires rear-facing engines, and we'll need this for slower-than-light travel within a solar system. Imaginary propulsions like warp, hyper, or jump drives can benefit from believable limitations. We should also remember that locations in space are ever-changing positions, so that how long it takes to travel between 2 points is seldom the same, or convenient for our characters. The need to enter a planet's atmosphere affects the structure of our ship, but world builders will be most interested in the internal organization and the effect we can make this have on people and story. Time and history. These tips come from Chapter 10 of Creating Places. Tip number 1. Create a universal calendar. Each kingdom may have its own calendar, which is fine, but how do we know that year 41 AE in Kingdom X is also year 4560 BI in Kingdom Y? A universal calendar. Create one for your own records even if you never share it with the audience. Tip number 2. What does your universal calendar start with? If the world acknowledges that universal calendar, you'll need an event recognized everywhere. On Earth, we use the birth of Christ. Does your world have a religious event, technological event or alien arrival, or a supernatural event of such magnitude? If you do, it's probably part of your story world's consciousness. Invent something you like because you'll end up using it. Tip number 3. Be smart about names. Don't call a month something like snow time. It is winter in half the world, but it'll be summer in the other half, and this won't make sense. And places near the equator aren't getting snow. Ever. Tip number 4. Be careful altering time frames. We can change the number of minutes in an hour, or hours in a day, but this is unwise because it messes with the audience's sense of passing time too much. But changing the number of days in a week, weeks in a month, or months in a year has less impact, particularly if we're only off by 1. Don't be too extreme unless you really need that for your story. People will forget about your different time frame, or you'll have to remind them all the time. Neither is good. Tip number 5. Create past events. There are many events we can put in the past to give spice to the present. Tech events like the first time something happened are appropriate for science fiction, like ship launches, weapons usage, or drive experiments or failures. Disasters are good too, even in fantasy worlds, where spells must go wrong sooner or later, sometimes on a huge scale. The gods might do something everyone remembers too. On the more mundane level are the rise and fall of sovereign powers, wars, groups forming, missions being undertaken, and artifacts being discovered, invented, destroyed, or seemingly lost. The more legendary, the better. We can even end up with story ideas from these. Summary of Creating Places Chapter 10. Time and History. History can enrich a world and provide us with cultural clashes, famous items, and world figures to which our characters and stories can refer or cite as inspiration. To save time, we can create a master history file with short entries that are invented in a few minutes and which do not need long explanations. Some can be turned into standalone stories if we stumble upon a great idea. Historic entries can be created at any time and can include events involving the gods, technology, supernatural wars, the rise and fall of sovereign powers, artifacts, and famous missions by groups or individuals. We also need a universal calendar to measure time, because each sovereign power might have its own calendar, making the correlation of events across kingdoms harder. The merits of keeping time frames similar to Earth's are discussed. This includes the reasons why minutes and hours benefit from little alteration, while the number of days, weeks, and months can experience greater variation without disrupting the audience's sense of time. Places of Interest. These tips come from Chapter 11 of Creating Places. Tip number 1. What lives in the catacombs? If we create catacombs, decide if monsters, animals, or other creatures live there. Do the surface dwellers know of these inhabitants or the passages? Do they use them too? What gets hidden there? Try to be creative about your use of these and make it important to your story, because just about everything has already been done. We just need a believable reason for their existence, abandonment, and current usage. Tip number 2. Use step wells. Google step wells in India and you'll see some interesting images we can leverage if we have water-dwelling species. These could connect to underground rivers and allow for interesting escapes or arrivals. Are they guarded? Are some of these made by water-dwelling species or by others hoping to reach them? Tip number 3. Create phenomenon sites. Places where an accident happened are good for magical, supernatural, or technological sites of importance, especially dangerous sites. Just imagine what could go wrong and choose a location and result. These can be good for creating monsters too, if there's radiation or something similar still going on there. We don't even need good explanations, making this fun to do. Tip number 4. What's underwater? A settlement under the waves offers chances to be innovative. A water-dwelling species makes this more attractive. Shipwrecks, including fallen spacecraft, can also harbor treasure or items that need to be recovered, and which can fall into the wrong hands. They could spawn monsters too. Tip number 5. The ordinary can be famous too. Sites of wars, religious incidents, and prophets or martyrs making themselves famous can also acquire significance. Use these places inside settlements or nearby because these can be less dramatic, with no radiation or other residue left over. Not everything has to be amazing. Summary of Creating Places Chapter 11. Places of Interest. Even ordinary locations can acquire significance due to scale, features, or people associated with them. These include monuments, graves, catacombs, and hidden passages, and unusual buildings, whether built in stone, flying in the air, or floating on water like Venice. Ruins offer places for treasure to be found or horrors unleashed, including magical or technological items. Event sites and shipwrecks also give inhabitants places to reference, seek, or avoid, and can be where items of our invention originated. Drawing maps. These tips come from bonus chapter 12 of Creating Places. Tip number 1. You don't need drawing skill. With modern map-making programs like Campaign Cartographer, you don't need drawing skills to create maps. I can't draw to save my life, and I have made maps I published with my works, including those inside Creating Places. You can just place pre-existing icons for trees, mountains, and settlements and can rearrange them. It takes some imagination but quickly becomes fun to do. Tip number 2. Maps help us invent conflict. As we draw land features and seas, we can imagine conflicts between kingdoms about who has access to something and who doesn't, then what they must do to form agreements, or go to war with each other over it. Even if we don't want to write about such things, the sovereign powers where our characters originate are engaged in these conflicts or friendships, and our characters will have attitudes based on this. Tip number 3. Use Earth analogues. If you have no idea what to draw, just steal somewhere on Earth and purposely do a poor job of drawing the country outline. You can include all the same land features and few will recognize what it's based on. You could draw the US with a different shape and then cut it in half too, or add a C in the middle. A major change like that makes it less recognizable. Tip number 4. Be smart about regional maps. Even if you only want to draw a map of a region, not the whole continent, think about the continent anyway. Things like mountain ranges, prevailing winds, and rain shadows will still affect your region. You needn't draw them, just make a note to yourself that the wind is from that way and there's a mountain range over there. Tip number 5. No one expects a settlement map. It can be fun to use City Designer from Pro Fantasy to create city maps, but no one's expecting one in your books. It is worthwhile if the layout is very specific and hard to describe succinctly to an audience, in which case they'll appreciate a map. Only do this if you feel the need to lay out a place, which can be only filled in with the most important buildings you desire. Summary of Creating Places Bonus Chapter 12. Drawing Maps. While drawing maps is optional in world building, they can help us visualize where everything's taking place, and if done well, can even be included in published works. Drawing skill isn't really needed, as modern map-making programs allow us to place pre-existing shapes onto a map and move them around. Continent maps help us decide on the location and qualities of land features like mountains, forests, and deserts so that we can create a realistic ecosystem. The location of settlements, rivers, and bodies of water will also impact the stories and lives of characters we create. We can also draw settlement, dungeon, and ship maps to solidify our decisions and find new inspiration in our layouts. End of Creating Places Tips. Cultures and Beyond Tips. Everything not covered in the first 2 volumes lies within the finale, Cultures and Beyond, The Art of World Building Volume 3. This includes creating culture, magic systems, religions, military groups, the supernatural, technology, magic items, names, and even mundane items like a monetary system. Much of this work ties together our life forms and places. These are the things we comment on most during a story, and which our characters considered. Without them, no world-building project is complete. The tips in this section are from Cultures and Beyond, The Art of World Building Volume 3. Cultures. These tips come from Chapter 1 of Cultures and Beyond. Tip number 1. Culture clash is useful. Invent culture to cause conflict. Anytime we need characters to have bad feelings towards each other, a culture clash is an easy way to create this. For traveling characters, it's a virtual given. People are sensitive and judgmental. We don't need people to have screwed up in a serious way, just offend someone in a trivial one. Tip number 2. Understand cultural origins. Values, beliefs, and morals are the origins of culture. These are ideas, and they manifest as rituals, habits, customs, art, music, and the use of language. We should therefore create those values, beliefs, and morals, and then figure out how they manifest. That's culture. Tip number 3. Consider the government. A sovereign power's government greatly impacts culture from the top down. Consider how much freedom and control people have. Less means less variation at regional, settlement, and social group levels of culture. More freedom means more variation. Tip number 4. Know what's valued. While morals and values are slightly different, they can both be used to invent culture. A more high-minded society will value different traits like dignity, equality, politeness, and tolerance than a barbaric one, which might value self-reliance, courage, respect, and integrity. Tip number 5. Determine cultural scope. Are we creating culture throughout a kingdom, region, or social group? Culture trickles down, so what's valued in the United States might be less valued on the East Coast and more valued in New York City, especially in the punk rock scene. Determine what level we're inventing culture for, because it's not uniform across all these levels. Tip number 6. Determine cultural vision. Have an overall vision so that we avoid creating manifestations of culture that clash with each other. An obvious example is elves acting refined at dinner, but acting like savages when making love. Invent a vision, which springs from values, that guides our invention of culture, so incongruity doesn't spring up unless we want it to. Tip number 7. Race as culture. A frequent complaint is when a fictitious race has a monoculture. Every society in that race is identical. The difficulty of creating cultures likely causes this oversight. Don't make all elves the same regardless of where they live or the social class to which they belong. It's not realistic, and yes, people do complain about it. Tip number 8. Create culture you can use. Some aspects of culture are far more useful to us and should be our focus. This includes greetings, meal etiquette, phrases, rituals, and daily life routines. Other items like songs, clothing, and architecture styles are less helpful because readers won't see them. This is less true in a visual medium. Tip number 9. Alter Earth expressions. We can leverage anything from Earth, but changing our expressions is a quick way to make people seem like they're from somewhere else. What the hell becomes what in Tartarus, for example. Make a list of things you say and just invent alternate versions. It doesn't take long and the cumulative effect works. Tip number 10. Alter daily routines. Creating a daily life schedule that differs from Earth is a fast way to make a place seem different. Be sure to use climate as part of this. People in cold places may venture out in midday when it's warmest, while those in hot and humid places may stay indoors for a siesta. Having a sense of location helps with regional variations on culture. Summary of Cultures and Beyond, Chapter 1. Creating Cultures. This chapter discusses the differences between a culture and a custom, and that morals, values, and beliefs underlie cultural aspects. A cultural vision should be based on these and inform all decisions subsequently made. World builders can determine the scope of an invented culture, as some are regional or throughout a sovereign power. Cultural depictions have visible, audible, and performance aspects that can be defined. These include body issues such as body language, hairstyles, gestures, clothing, and more. Greetings and farewells should be defined because characters will use them. Similarly, swear words, slang, expressions, and colloquialisms can be created to characterize interactions. The daily life of a culture is depicted in dining, bathing, sleeping, employment, and transportation rituals and behaviors, while pastimes, holidays, and more create a respite. Even architecture can be influenced by culture. Organizations. These tips come from Chapter 2 of Cultures and Beyond. Tip number 1. What do they want? Every group wants something, so decide whether they want to control an object, possess land, hold power, uphold philosophical ideas, or something else. Not knowing what they want and why makes for an unconvincing group. We also don't understand what will drive them, upset them, or make them go too far when thwarted. A goal is everything. Tip number 2. Decide who their friends and enemies are. It's too simplistic to decide that an organization operates without allies and enemies. Whether individuals, species, kingdoms, or other groups, those connections decide who they are. We sometimes must create those other groups first, but circle back and finish this connection. It will pay off. Tip number 3. Create a power structure. Does power rest with a committee or a single strongman? Is that strength physical or supernatural? Knowing who's really in power and why helps us create tension within the group. Otherwise, they seem to just get along with each other too well. Tension is a story's lifeblood, so don't overlook threats to those in power and how it can be taken away and by who. Tip number 4. How do people join or leave? Can people leave this group, or are they murdered for trying? What do they lose if leaving? How do they join? What must they do to be accepted or remain? This can add tension for members who may be tempted away by other characters in our story. Tip number 5. Create a history. An organization has people with a shared viewpoint, so what brought them together? What ideas drive people to them? This can be the rise or fall of an idea or government that they miss or want to oppose. Leverage other historical events already in the setting by creating a group or two who dislike what has happened. Summary of Cultures and Beyond, Chapter 2. Creating Organizations. Organizations for good or evil are a staple of both fantasy and science fiction. This chapter discusses both group types and their worldviews, plus common traits like goals, enemies, friends, and their source of and quest for power. How members join and leave such groups is an important element, as some organizations might prevent or inhibit departure. Prerequisites can also bind a member to the group. The history and actions of a group are an important part of its reputation. Armed Forces. These tips come from Chapter 3 of Cultures and Beyond. Tip number 1. What government type do they work for? Virtually all armed forces groups work for a government, so determine this before doing anything. A democracy and a dictatorship will have different armies, for example. How? The latter will be extremely rigid, far more so than the other, including potentially no personal life at all. The military isn't known for great freedom even in a democracy, but imagine how much worse it is in a totalitarian government. Tip number 2. Create symbols and colors. In the real world, we immediately recognize the symbols of the military and make judgments about anything emblazoned with them, from personal uniforms to buildings and ships. Not creating these is unrealistic, while creating them only takes a minute. Tip number 3. Decide how people join. Knowing what it takes to become a member helps us decide on skills and how elite a group is. This also creates a reputation for members. Are there prerequisites, like the ability to ride a horse or fly a ship? Are certain races forbidden or prized? What physical traits does one need? Can one acquire missing items like improving strength? What sorts of tests must be passed, and how many chances does one get? This adds pressure and pride or humiliation for those trying to join. Tip number 4. Understand and use existing ranks. Know what a lieutenant, major, and colonel is in the Army and their respective Navy or Air Force counterparts, then use the same ranks and job functions, even if you change the titles for your world, which isn't recommended. Only those in the military usually know these things and aren't bored with them. Confusion, or exposition to explain them, is the only result of being clever here. Tip number 5. What's their reputation? We all think certain things of each military group in our sovereign power, and so do our characters of theirs, so decide what the group is known for. Are they respected? Feared? Did you pick a fight with one or avoid that? Are you impressed or scornful? This matters even when our characters are not from such a group, because they'll often have to deal with those who are. Summary of Cultures and Beyond, Chapter 3. Creating Armed Forces. Military groups like the Army, Navy, Air and Space Force, and Knights are a staple of both fantasy and science fiction. We can leverage existing ideas or craft our own. Doing so means deciding how someone joins and leaves a military group, including requirements, tests, and training. Some species and races might be forbidden or assigned special roles, and throughout history, famous members can inspire pride or loathing we can use. When devising military units and ranks, it helps to understand Earth analogues, so some basics are included in this chapter. The worldview, uses, locations, place in society, and symbols are all important elements of memorable armed forces, and this chapter covers them all. Religions. These tips come from Chapter 4 of Cultures and Beyond. Tip number 1. Start with history. Religions are more tied to history than anything else in world building. Invent a prophet and his story, which can give us artifacts, holidays, traditions, and more. Virtually everything springs from this, making it the obvious starting point. Tip number 2. The control factor. Religions exercise control over practitioners' lives to one degree or another, from how often to pray, when, where, and what words to say, even what actions to perform before, during, and after. These manifestations of faith are critical to how believers and non-believers view the religion. Is it too strict? Not strict enough? Tip number 3. Create symbols. What's a religion without symbols? We create these using our prophet's story. If he first spoke to a god while wearing a cloak, eating an apple, and standing beside a tree type, we have 3 symbols right there. It's that easy to create them because we're just associating trivial things with momentous occasions. Tip number 4. Invent clergy. Priests can be viewed in specific ways depending on how they act or restrictions that are placed on them. This reflects on an entire religion and how the populace view it. Are there scandals that affect them, or do they fear that one will emerge? Power is held by those in high regard, so how can the clergy fall from grace based on inappropriate behavior by wayward members? And what defines wayward? Tip number 5. Do they convert? Are there missionaries in this religion, or do they let people come to them? The former is significant because it makes them active rather than passive characters who might upset people, including our main characters, whom they may try to convert. The religion will have a reputation for this if so. Use it to personalize them. Summary of Cultures and Beyond, Chapter 4. Creating Religions. While some items we create have history as a minor element, history is crucial with religions, so first we look at where and how the religion formed, including a prophetic figure and the role of a god, should one exist. Creation and end-of-world myths and the afterlife are important elements that potential followers consider, along with the requirements for worship and the penalty for failing to follow the rules. How someone joins and leaves a religion can be trivial or significant and includes the possibility of expulsion. We'll need holy sites too, and a decision on holidays, languages, customs, sex, relationships with everyone from species to other religions, and what members of the clergy are like, and their role in society. Most importantly, we need the symbols and beliefs of this religion. The supernatural. These tips come from Chapter 5 of Cultures and Beyond. Tip number 1. Origins aren't needed. Even scientists sometimes don't understand where various energies they've detected originate, so we don't need to state this either. That said, an interesting idea that creates even more mystery is never a bad thing. In fantasy, there's a tendency to decide that the gods did it, so science fiction seems to offer more opportunity for mystery. Tip number 2. Determine prevalence. How often is a phenomenon encountered? It may always exist but only flare up at certain times, maybe even regularly, like the Old Faithful geyser. Or supernatural elements might be common, which tends to reduce reactions to them. Decide how often the event occurs and whether rarity is something the story needs. Tip number 3. Determine impact. If the supernatural is very common, such as everyone being able to cast minor spells, then this could greatly impact society. Unless we intend to think our way through every detail, it's sensible to decide that magic, for example, is quite limited, as is often shown in fantasy. Thinking our way through every detail can lead to many unique revelations which set our world apart. Tip number 4. Do supernatural creatures exist? If so, they often take the form of extensions to their abilities, such as a horse that runs faster or can cross into other realities. Decide what problems the story has and how something like this can help, but be careful not to make the solution perfect. For example, make the faster horse unable to go all the way to the destination. Tip number 5. Are there demigods? A figure like Cupid is a lesser god with a specific function. We can create such individuals if we need them, or if they can affect our characters' lives. We can also create half-gods like Hercules. Decide on their abilities, origins, function, and reputation. A few infamous past deeds round them out. Summary of Cultures and Beyond, Chapter 5, Creating the Supernatural. Supernatural elements exist in both fantasy and science fiction and can be used to add to the unexpected. The audience may expect magic, for example, but not our version of it, so there's room for originality here. We can also create energies that give rise to phenomena, beings, or places like magic pathways or alternate worlds and realities that impact our setting and stories. How much impact and prevalence these supernatural elements have, and how to determine this, are an important focus of this chapter. Systems of magic. These tips come from Chapter 6 of Cultures and Beyond. Tip number 1. Are unpredictable results possible? In some worlds, like Harry Potter, spells that aren't cast correctly still go off, but with unexpected results. Is this possible in your setting, or does the spell fail? The latter seems more believable. The ability to so easily screw it up makes magic so absurdly dangerous that it's likely forbidden pretty much everywhere. Tip number 2. Decide if spells are needed. Do people need to recite memorized lines, make gestures, or use physical materials to do magic? Or can they do it by force of will, like a god? In theory, spells are to achieve a specific result within a range of possible results, meaning limits are built in. The caster's skill and strength determine where in the possible range their spell falls. But if willing things to happen, there may be fewer limits and more inherent danger. What makes sense for the story? Tip number 3. Have a good name. While we can just call it magic and keep it simple, this doesn't work when there's more than one type in the setting. Invent cool names for each to increase audience attraction. We can also call the practitioners a related name instead of the generic word wizards, for example. This distinguishes our setting, too. Tip number 4. Sanderson's laws are not laws. Author Brandon Sanderson proposed 3 laws of magic systems that are not laws, but guidelines that should not make us feel restricted. But they're worth noting. They amount to making the reader understand the magic before using it to solve problems, creating limitations on magic, and expanding what you have before adding new ideas. These are all sound advice. Tip number 5. Decide what training is needed. What can magic users do without training? Anything at all? Do they need formal training to become powerful, skilled, or even be allowed to perform magic? Refusal to accept training is an easy way to make someone an outlaw. Decide what sort of training is available and from who. A person, a group, a guild, a university, or a sovereign power. Defining this allows us to create distinctions between wizards who received training from one or another. Summary of Cultures and Beyond, Chapter 6, Creating a System of Magic. Magic systems can be simple or complex, but they should always be consistent. This chapter discusses the methods and principles of good systems and how to create them. This includes the importance of naming them, deciding if spells are needed and what those are for, whether spells can go wrong and how, and different types of magic we might want to include in our setting. We'll also look at how much training someone might need, what forms that training takes, and learn how to decide what's right for our setting. And no discussion of magic is complete without a look at how to invent spells. Items. These tips come from Chapter 7 of Cultures and Beyond. Tip number 1. Use standard forms. Don't be afraid to create magic items that are typical in form, like jewelry or clothes. Being able to wear the item minimizes the risk of loss and keeps it handy when it's suddenly needed. This is a huge advantage, so while a magic ring is a cliché, that form of item is also helpful. Tip number 2. Limit their powers. For both tech and magic items, make sure they don't solve a character's problems perfectly or it's too convenient. Something must go wrong. The battery in a tech item might have drained. A magic item can suffer a similar fate, a rationale being that whoever created the spell wasn't powerful enough to make it better. Tip number 3. Avoid talking items. The infamous talking sword is a fast way to get mocked, and yet we have devices that talk to us now, not to mention the AI in science fiction, where we can get away with it, but in fantasy it's still frowned upon without a good explanation. Tip number 4. Marry form to function. The purpose of an item doesn't always match its form. The powers in magic rings, wands, and staves have little to do with their shape. This is often true of tech, too. When the purpose is more active, marry function to form, such as an arrow or sword designed to strike something. Tip number 5. Invent regular items, too. Everyday items acquire significance by being associated with famous or infamous people and events, like a prophet, hero, villain, or royalty. We and our characters are less likely to make a big deal of these, but creating them fleshes out our setting. Besides, making a big deal out of everything is like having high drama every moment. It's too much. Summary of Cultures and Beyond, Chapter 7, Creating Items. Whether magical, technological, or more ordinary, memorable items exist in our setting whether we mention them or not. Science fiction likely expects them, and fantasy often has at least one magic item someone has or covets in a story. But even ordinary items can be given significance through association with important people, places, or events. This chapter discusses how to invent their properties, origins, and form, and how to determine who is likely to use or want them. The creation of an AI is also included. Languages. These tips come from Chapter 8 of Cultures and Beyond. Tip number 1. Read books. There are several books on how to create a language, including The Art of Language Invention by the guy who created Dothraki for Game of Thrones. Reading this will convince you this is doable or not, and what you need to know if doing it yourself or even hiring someone else to do it. Tip number 2. They can be a distraction. No one but us understands these words, and they can distract a reader. Even those who take the time to sound them out have been pulled out of our story while they do so. We may want to just avoid this altogether. Tip number 3. We have 3 options. We can ignore language creation, we can make up nonsense words as we go along, or we can create a real language to one degree or another. The only people who really know which we did are conlangers, a small group of people whose opinion may not matter to us. Tip number 4. You may coach a narrator. If you hire someone to create an audiobook for you, you'll need to coach them on how to say everything unless you do the book yourself. Make sure you can say everything yourself if this might happen. Tip number 5. Hire a pro. The Language Creation Society's site is https://conlang.org. This site makes it easy to hire an expert for as little as $100 or up to $800. The difference is how much they give you, but understanding what we're getting may require reading those books I mentioned. Summary of Cultures and Beyond, Chapter 8. Creating Languages. Creating a language is one of the most challenging aspects of world building, but it's also one of the few that we can outsource. How and where to do so is discussed. Even so, some basic terms must be understood so we know what we're buying and receiving from our expert. If we choose to do it ourselves, we should consider whether it benefits our audience and how, and whether it's even a burden that we can save both them and ourselves. This chapter will not teach world builders how to invent a language because there are entire books on the subject, and those are referenced here, but it will discuss the pros and cons of constructing a language and what we lose by not having one or more. Names. These tips come from Chapter 9 of Cultures and Beyond. Tip number 1. Avoid apostrophes and hyphens. The use of both is cliched. If doing this, make sure that most names from that culture are the same so that it doesn't seem like we're just trying to be exotic, which is how this got a bad reputation. The hyphens are caused by concatenating a mother and a father's surname. An apostrophe replaces missing letters, and we can easily live without doing that. Tip number 2. Keep names short. Long names are a way to distinguish one race from another, but no one likes trying to sound out something really long. However, such names can exist, so if we do this, only use the long version once and shorten it for the rest of the book. Tip number 3. Alter existing words. We can take words we see around us and remove or replace letters and syllables to make new words. We can add prefixes or suffixes. We can substitute vowels. These techniques are fun and effective. Tip number 4. Surname sources. We can use places, occupations, nicknames, and even first names for last or surnames. This helps us reuse places and names we've already created. Places can imply a character's origin, but some, like Hill, are too generic for that. Professions can imply at least their parents' background, such as a blacksmith getting the last name Smith. Tip number 5. Avoid name generators. There are free online programs that can create names for us with a button click. A quick search will turn them up. But they tend to feel impersonal, and when we need multiple names, these programs are unlikely to create ones that seem to fit together. Summary of Cultures and Beyond, Chapter 9. Creating Names. Many techniques exist for creating names of people, places, and things, and all of them leverage our creativity to make the results and process more satisfying than using name generators, which are also discussed. Caveats and pitfalls abound, for while a great name elevates our story, bad ones turn off audiences, or keep them from talking about a character with an unpronounceable or unspellable name. We look at the differences between given names, surnames, compound names, and different ways to leverage parts of our invented world for all of them. The tips in this chapter will make this required activity fun and rewarding. Everything else. These tips come from Chapter 10 of Cultures and Beyond. Tip number 1. Simplify monetary systems. Audiences don't care about our monetary system or want to remember it. We'll seldom be mentioning it anyway. In the United States, we just say dollars and cents, never mentioning pennies, nickels, etc. So do the same in a fictional world. It can even be smart to say that a $100 item here is a 100 credit item in science fiction, for example. Why figure out what everything is worth? Tip number 2. Invent some crimes. In a world with magic or new tech, we have crimes unknown to us on Earth. This is a fun imagination exercise, including deciding punishments. Be reasonable about why the laws exist and find ways characters can be constrained by them or run afoul of them, likely with traveling characters. Tip number 3. Keep clothing simple. In visual mediums, someone else will design clothing anyway, and for authors, spending too much time describing an outfit is unwise, even when we use details to characterize our character. If we must research what parts of a clothing are called, our audience won't know what we're referring to. Focus on the impression they create more than using terms. Tip number 4. How educated is everyone? In fantasy settings, educational levels tend to be lower, as in the 1500s to 1700s on Earth, while science fiction often suggests people are more educated, but they needn't be. Ignorant people can drive a car well, and maybe they can fly a spaceship too, especially if it has an AI they just need to command. Either way, we should work out how much education is expected for culture and whether characters met that expectation or not. Tip number 5. How informed is everyone? Regardless of education, information flow can be compromised. In fantasy, it's typically word of mouth and prone to some inaccuracy. In science fiction, it might be better, but that's assuming people have access to data. They may not, and for our story needs we can choose how ignorant they are. This helps us create biases that place them at odds with those who bring them more information, creating conflict. This is a good reason to restrict information flow in both genres. Summary of Cultures and Beyond, Chapter 10, Creating Everything Else. Anything that didn't fit into another chapter in this series is collected here. We'll look at crimes and punishments, monetary systems, educational systems, and more. The subjects have little in common and are hard to summarize other than to say each is a relatively small task. Conclusion. These tips come from Chapter 11 of Cultures and Beyond. Tip number 1. Stay organized. However you do it, keep your world-building files organized so that you can easily find information. And don't repeat info in more than one place because you won't remember to change it in both. I keep a master spreadsheet where I can see, at a glance, certain basics about every city on a continent, such as population, races present, age, colors, and symbols. And in each city file, I don't mention these things, alluding to the spreadsheet. Tip number 2. Follow your own rules. If we state that no one can do something, don't have someone be able to do it. The exception is when a character is special in achieving this impossible result, but do that on purpose, not because you made up a rule, forgot, and then had someone break it later without you even commenting on it. Audiences notice these things. Keep a list of your rules and do yourself a favor. Don't be ironclad about them. This gives us flexibility to break one when we need to. Tip number 3. Consider a partner. World building can take huge amounts of time. Consider doing a joint venture with friends where you build a setting together, collaborating and dividing up the work. Just be advised that if this friendship ever fails, you might start arguing over who gets to use the setting. A simple written agreement can specify you each have ownership to write stories in it, but you'll need to work out these details. Tip number 4. Remember to have fun. Try not to get so bogged down in world building that it's no fun anymore and you don't have time to write stories, or promote them. Use the resources I've provided to help you decide what to skip and when. World Building University has a free course that's designed to help you decide what to do. Use promo code 185TIPS once accelerated world building is available. Tip number 5. Use world building tools. Whether it's my series, The Art of Worldbuilding, my school, Worldbuilding University, or books, podcasts, and YouTube videos by others, get familiar with many opinions on how things can be done and take it all with a grain of salt. There are few things we must get right. Be flexible and don't get overwhelmed. Summary of Cultures and Beyond, Chapter 11. Conclusion. In the series conclusion, we look at how to organize our files of world-building notes so that the info glut doesn't become overwhelming. This includes some tools others have created, whether free or not, and the pros and cons of using them. We'll also look at different approaches to world-building and how they can affect our working methodology and results. Final thoughts include the merits of following our own rules per world and whether partnering with another world builder is a good idea or not. End of Cultures and Beyond tips. Templates and newsletter. Effective world building requires having written down details about the created world. To help you organize and jumpstart your efforts, each volume in the series includes templates in the appendices. While these templates are not included in this tips book, you can download these templates for free by joining the newsletter for The Art of Worldbuilding at http://www.artofworldbuilding.com/newsletter. As each volume is published, whether you've bought the book or not, subscribers will automatically receive an email with links to download the templates as Microsoft Word files, which you can repeatedly use. Worldbuilding University. WBU has online courses that provide step-by-step instruction on how to create all aspects of great fantasy and science fiction worlds. Each includes a series of video lessons, quizzes to test your retention of what you've learned, and assignments designed to make your creation a reality instead of a dream. Courses are intended for both authors, game designers, and hobbyists. A free course is available to get you started. See the website or mailing list for details. http://www.worldbuilding.university. The podcast. The Art of Worldbuilding podcast expands on the material within the series. The additional examples offer world builders more insight into ramifications of decisions. You can hear the podcast, read transcripts, and learn more about the episodes at http://www.artofworldbuilding.com/podcasts. Closing credits. About the author. Randy Ellefson has written fantasy fiction since his teens and is an avid world builder, having spent 3 decades creating Lorien, which has its own website. He has a bachelor's of music and classical guitar, but has always been more of a rocker, having released several albums and earned endorsements from music companies. He's a professional software developer and runs a consulting firm in the Washington, D.C. area. He loves spending time with his son and daughter when not writing, making music, or playing golf.